In this video lesson, we'll discuss the secession of the southern states and the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln's inaugural address was firm yet conciliatory. There would be no conflict unless the South provoked it. And secession of the southern states was wholly impractical because they could not actually physically separate. You could not physically separate the two sections of the country. They were woven together and sharing the same continent. The North and South were bound inseparably, and Lincoln argued that there could be no sectional divorce, that there was no way to separate them. Uncontested secession would create new controversies. What share of the national debt should the South be forced to take with it if they did secede? What portion of the jointly held federal territories, if any, should the Confederate States be given? How would a fugitive slave issue be resolved? The Underground Railroad would certainly redouble its activity, and it would have to transport its passengers only across the Ohio River, not all the way to Canada. And it was conceivable, or was this a conceivable solution, that if the southern states seceded from the Union and became their own country, would that solve the problems? A united United States had been paramount as a republic in the Western Hemisphere. And if this powerful democracy should break into two hostile parts, the European nations would probably be delighted. They probably could feel that they could transplant to America their ancient concept of the balance of power. The colonies of the European powers in the New World, notably Great Britain, would thus be made safer against the Yankees, and they would be more inclined to defy the Monroe Doctrine and to seize American territory, which was definitely a fear of Abraham Lincoln as well. South Carolina will assail Fort Sumter in actually the beginning shots of the war. So the issue of the divided Union comes to a head over the matter of federal forts in the South. As the seceding states leave, they had seized the United States arsenals, mints, and other public properties within their borders. Fort Sumter was in South Carolina, which was the first state to secede from the Union, and protected Charleston Harbor. Ominously, the choices presented to Lincoln by Fort Sumter were all bad, and there was not going to be a successful choice for him at this point. The stronghold had provisions that would only last a few weeks, until the middle of April of 1861. And if no supplies were coming, the commander would have to surrender. Lincoln did not feel that Fort Sumter was strong enough to take as his obligation to protect federal property. But if he sent reinforcements, the South Carolinians would undoubtedly fight back. And he could not tolerate federal fort blocking, or they could not tolerate the fort blocking an important seaport, which was in control of South Carolina. After an antagonizing indecision, Lincoln adopted a middle-of-the-road solution and largely leaves it up to a decision of the South. He notifies South Carolina that an expedition would be sent with a provision to the garrison, though not to reinforce it, but only to resupply it. But the eyes of the South saw very much otherwise. A Union naval force was sent by Abraham Lincoln on its way to Fort Sumter, which was a move that the South regarded as an act of aggression. And on April 12, 1861, the cannon of the South Carolinians opened fire on the fort, while the crowds in Charleston applauded. After a 34-hour bombardment, the dazed garrison surrendered. No lives were lost, but the fort now becomes a possession of South Carolina and the Confederacy. The shelling of the fort electrified the North and infuriated them, which all at once responded to the cries of "Remember Fort Sumter" and "Save the Union." And even though the fort was lost, the Union could still be saved. Lincoln had turned a tactical defeat into a very calculated victory. The Southerners had fired the first shot against the United States, and now an armed response was demanded by Lincoln. So he promptly issued a call to the states for 75,000 militiamen and volunteers, and they came forward in such enthusiastic numbers that many were turned away. On April 19th and April 27th, the president proclaimed a leaky blockade of southern seaports. The call for troops, in turn, aroused the South, much as to the attack on Fort Sumter had aroused the North. Lincoln was now actively waging war, and it was an aggressive war from the Southern point of view. A lot of times when the South, if you were in the South as a student learning about the Civil War, oftentimes it's taught as the War of Northern Aggression, while in the North it's taught as the Civil War. So there is a difference of perspective there. 7 states became 11 as Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina reluctantly joined the Confederacy. Richmond, Virginia replaced Montgomery, Alabama as the Confederate capital because it was too near to Washington for strategic comfort on either side. The only slave states left were the crucial border states. This group consisted of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and later West Virginia. If the North had fired the first shot, some or all of these doubtful states probably would have seceded, and the South might well have succeeded in its attempt to create a second country. The border group actually contained a white population more than half of that of the entire Confederacy. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri would almost double the manufacturing capacity of the South and increase its supply of horses and mules. The strategic prize of the Ohio River flowed along the northern border of Kentucky and West Virginia. 2 of its navigable tributaries penetrated deep into the heart of Dixie. Much of the Confederacy's grain, gunpowder, and iron was produced in that area. In dealing with the border states, President Lincoln did not rely solely on morals, but successfully used methods of dubious legality. In Maryland, he declared martial law and sent troops because Maryland threatened to cut off Washington from the north. Lincoln also deployed Union soldiers in western Virginia and notably in Missouri, which was a slave state, where they fought besides Unionists in a local civil war within the larger Civil War. Any official statement of the North's war aims was profoundly influenced by the teetering border states. At the very outset, Lincoln was obliged to declare publicly that he was not fighting to free the African Americans or the slaves. The anti-slavery declaration was not a good political move, but one that Lincoln felt he had to make at the time. An anti-slavery war was also extremely unpopular in the butternut region of southern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, because that area had largely been settled by Southerners who had carried their racial prejudices with them when they crossed the Ohio River. Lincoln insisted repeatedly that his purpose in fighting the war was to save the Union at all costs, and thus the war began not as one between slave and free soil, but on the part of the Union. So Lincoln's purpose for beginning the Civil War was not to free the slaves, but to save the Union. Slavery also colored the character of most of the war in the West. In Indian Territory, most of the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, sided with the Confederacy, and some owned slaves and felt a common cause with the South. So to secure the loyalty of the tribes in the Indian Territory, the Confederate government agreed to take over federal payments to the tribes and invited Native Americans to send delegates to the Confederate Congress. In return, the tribes supplied troops to the Confederate Army to fight the war. Meanwhile, a rival faction of Cherokees and many Plains Indians sided with the Union. So there were Native Americans fighting on both sides. There were many Northern volunteers from the Southern states and many Southern volunteers from the Northern states. The Mountain Whites of the South sent north some 50,000 men, and the loyal slave states contributed some 300,000 soldiers to the Union. We'll discuss more about the impact and the choices that had to be made between the North and South and which side they would be a part of in our discussions in class.